Hi, and welcome to the first ever Rainbow Space Magic Con. This is the How Our Queer Past Influences Our Queer Science Fiction Future panel. My name is Michael Williams. I write science fiction, horror, urban fantasy. I will say that of my horror, it is horror that remembers that it has a sense of humor. And I've written a vampire urban fantasy series about a vampire lord who lives in suburbia called The Withrow Chronicles. I have written a series called Servant Sovereign, which is historical time travel urban fantasy set in San Francisco. And I am currently writing a series called Autumn about a far future science fiction detective. Up next.
Catherine?
Okay. Hi, I'm Catherine Lundoff. I'm an author, editor, and publisher from Minneapolis. I run Queen of Swords Press. I'm the author of several different collections of horror, queer science fiction, and fantasy, a menopausal werewolf series. I'm working on book 2 right now, should be out by the end of the year. I also publish authors like AJ Fitzwater and Alex Axe. And my short fiction has appeared everywhere from Fireside Magazine to Vampire the Masquerade tie-ins. So, Bob or Trevor?
Okay, all right. So basically I'm Bob Angell, and I write under RR Angell. I write literary, science fiction, fantasy. I've been writing for a couple of decades now. Everything I write is queer, even if you can't tell. I came out in 1982, marches, vigils, pride rallies, lived through the deadly pandemic, and my husband and I were cleaning the house this morning, and I didn't see this before, but this is the June Advocate, and it says, half of America, I can't believe the government would ignore an epidemic that threatens thousands of lives. Queers? Really? Okay, so we might talk a little bit more about that later. But so I protected the AIDS quilt in 1987. I've read Names of the Dead at the AIDS appearances in DC. I've been active in social justice since 1993 when I joined the UU Church with my husband. I've seen and lived history. I've testified at the Maryland Senate for equality marriage, and read a few books over the years and been on a bunch of queer panels, which is how actually Catherine and I met. So that's it. C'est moi.
Oh, I guess it's me then.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me?
Yep.
No?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Hi. I'm Trevor Barton. The Brobots trilogy is my first fiction. It was initially self-published and then offered contracts by 2 different publishers and came out last year as this omnibus edition, which still needs reviews on Amazon. So if anybody feels like reviewing this, that would be a tremendous help. Thank you. It's science fiction turned space opera with LGBT characters and follows sentient androids or brobots as they fight for the right to exist as a species. Reflections drawing on LGBT history, which is part of what we're here to talk about on the panel session. It was reviewed by Geek Syndicate in the UK, Gay Star News, Wrote Podcast, and a few others, and made me a top 20 author for LGBT science fiction on Amazon more than once. I now have new standalone speculative fiction under consideration, and I'm hoping to break into the mainstream next year. I'm joining you from the UK, if you can't already tell from my accent, and I'm really pleased to be here with all these lovely other authors.
So on to the next question.
On to the first question.
Yeah.
Which is, what does queer spec fic mean to me?
Well, Bob, you're already talking, so go with it.
All right, fine. So I'm old school. So back in the day, any queer content at all.
Have we lost Bob?
I think we just lost Bob.
I think we might have.
I'll in that case, so what does queer speculative fiction mean to me? It partly means writing what wasn't there. As a 20-something, I would have loved a book like Robots to be available. So there's that aspect. I came out fully at the age of 23. I'm now 45. So I didn't discover our greats until recently, you know, getting into Le Guin or DNFing Delaney or what have you. So now it means digging into more obscure stuff like China Mountain Jiang by Margaret F. McHugh, which is an SF masterwork with a gay protagonist. Who knew? And other recent greats like Autonomous by Annalee Newitz, or work by Russ Dadd and a few others, and trying to understand what our canon is and my place in it if I have one, and stuff like that. Anybody
Hey,
else?
Catherine.
Sure. So I've been out 4 years, less than Bob. Go us. So I've been out for about 35 years as queer, bisexual. And I got into science fiction and fantasy fandom through a lot of queer classic readings. So I'm one of Samuel Delaney's former students. I've done projects with Melissa Scott. I've written a series on the history of queer spec fic, which I'll post in the chat shortly, that got republished on Queer Sci-Fi. And so for me, I think there's a tremendous weight of history and influence, and a lot of things that contemporary audiences are maybe not as aware of, because the magic of queer history is we just keep rewriting it endlessly. So I think for me, it's a combination of the characters and the theme and how that plays together. And it's the opportunity to see myself on the page or my community is on the page in a way that I'm not necessarily getting out of fiction that's geared more toward a mainstream straight audience.
I think for me, I grew up in the Southeast and way up in Appalachia in Western North Carolina, sort of in the deepest holler possible. And so I had very little exposure to queer culture, very little exposure to concepts of queer identity. And the first time that I read something and said, oh, I'm seeing the queer experience, is actually Interview with the Vampire, where I thought, oh, this is about people who know who they are, but the world around them thinks that it knows who they are, and it's wrong. And so for me, like, queer speculative fiction kind of has this broader definition of anytime it's a story of someone whose identity is concealed or they can't reveal it safely, and the world around them has made a ton of assumptions about them and what they want out of the world and what their motivations are, and it is just dead wrong. Everything that I write, like Bob said of his work, everything that I write is queer, and all of my main characters and most of my supporting characters are queer, and like explicitly queer in terms of they have a sexual identity or a gender identity or gender expression that sort of puts them in that spectrum. But it's also always about that sense of knowing who we are, and no one else knows who we are. And so I tend to lump a bunch of stuff into queer speculative fiction that I think a lot of other people might not. I think Battlestar Galactica is a queer story because it's about people who are people and also androids or something, and the people around them don't recognize that, and there's a lot about concealing your identity and to whom can you reveal it and whom can you trust, things like that. And ultimately, I think for me, queer spec fic breaks down into that. Whom can I trust?
Am I back?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So yes, sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on. Anyway, a lot of the things I'm going to do is talk a little bit about perspective, because it's a panel on queer history. But so I was going to say something about the Supreme Court ruling last Monday, that a lot of people didn't know that we could be fired for being gay until last Monday, and actually we still have problems with housing. And there's an act that's running through the Congress right now and called the Equality Act. So we hope that will go. But anyway, so personally, what does queer spec fic mean to me? Well, it means other people like me. It doesn't matter if there's planet, swords, magic, anything like that. I mean, I was always and still am always happy to find somebody who is queer in fiction, in the things that I'm reading. It used to be that if you ran across a queer character, they were the villain. That was the code word, and so everybody got killed. So positive queer stuff used to be very hard to find. It's often buried afterwards. And a good example would be, Ted Sturgeon's World Well Lost, that sort of did a flash. There was a big thing, and then it just kind of went away. I didn't ever find out about it until the internet, when I was doing a research for a panel that I ended up being on with Catherine up at WisCon a long time ago. One thing I do want to say is queer spec fic could also mean queer speculation fiction. So when I was a kid, I fell in love with Peter Pan when I saw Mary Martin play Peter Pan as a kid, when I was probably 5 years old, and later fell in love with Will Robinson of Lost in Space when that came out. And I told my grandmother that I wanted a green suit just like Peter Pan for Christmas, and that I was in love with him. And I also told her that, and so I was about 8 when I told her that I now loved Will Robinson and wanted a silver spacesuit for Christmas. And so that got some fun things, but part of the queer speculation and queer spec fic is looking for people like us. So I think the internet has done wonders for us. Now we have, and also the media. Now we have things like Star Trek Discovery and so on. So also there's a bit of subversion. In the old days, you had to sneak stuff in. So my friend Frank Robinson used to have, he was a fantastic writer, and all his books had gay content in them. And all of his books were always positive, and he never killed off his gay characters. And his first novel was published in 1956. His second novel was turned into a movie called The Towering.
Lost you again, Bob.
Should we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's at least start talking about it. So while we wait for Bob to rejoin us, we had started to make a list of things that we thought we could talk about a little bit during the course of this panel discussion. And the next thing on our list was, what does the queer science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, YA, et cetera, future look like? Are we seeing discernible trends? Are there quantum leaps involved in it? Where does that really come from? What do we see as the next thing?
I'm interested, Michael and Catherine, because you're both publishers as well as authors, like your spin on this, like your take on it.
Go ahead, Michael. You can start.
So I've been thinking about this question a lot since we started talking about what to discuss on the panel. And obviously there is a big emphasis right now on finding own voices stories where people tell us about their own experience rather than the rest of us sort of speculating about their experiences. I do certainly do some speculating about experiences other than my own in my fiction, but I would rather read somebody else telling me their version. One of the things that I see that I feel like is relatively new is instead of stories, the queer communities include a lot of experiences and a lot of perspectives and a lot of identities. And I feel like traditionally stories about a given identity have been marketed to and celebrated by people who share that specific identity. And so it would be much more common for a story about a bisexual woman to be marketed to women. And, and a gay cisgender man might not hear about that story, might not feel like he needed to care about that story. Whereas I feel like the internet is sort of encouraging us to learn about each other's stories, and that one of the big trends is people celebrating stories being told about identities other than their own by people who have that identity. And so there being more of a community feeling rather than there being sort of multiple splintered communities within storytelling and writing and publishing. You see more things like queer sci-fi than you do a publisher that tells that markets, publishes books about cisgender gay men to cisgender gay men and does not bother to tell other people that those books exist.
Yeah, I'm a little more pessimistic about it. But some of the things that I've seen since I've been, writing and publishing for over 20 years now, and it's, there's a definite, shift in how the internet has changed interpretations of what constitutes queer spec fic, what our communities are, how those change. I mean, the terminology alone is evolving so quickly. I'm working with a lot of authors who identify as non-binary and genderqueer, for example, who might have identified very differently 10 years ago because the language wasn't there to talk about how they felt themselves, to identify. And so I see a lot of changes in that. What I'm still sort of not seeing a lot of is when I came out in the mid 80s, there was a flowering for a while of mainstream publishers that were publishing out queer authors, primarily gay and lesbian authors. And that ceased to be interesting, profitable, whatever. And it took a while to kind of ramp back up. What I'm seeing now is the mainstream is publishing a lot more out queer authors, but there's a tendency to relegate it to novella length works, to short stories. The short story markets are wildly diverse. There's all kinds of stuff out there, which is really great. But the novel length and longer works are still getting indie published, or they're out with small presses. So that hasn't really caught up in a lot of ways. But looking forward, the main thing is that the excuse has always been that it wasn't profitable to sell works by queer authors about queer characters. And I'm just lumping everybody together in there. And it was always perceived as a niche market. It was always perceived as, we just don't have the readership for that. And so we'll just, we'll shunt Laurie Marks off, and we'll, ignore Jeff Ryman, and we'll ignore Elizabeth Lynn, and all these people who've been around for a long time doing this. And, so a lot of those moved on to medium-sized presses, or they're indie published, or they're no longer in the field, which has happened quite a bit as well. And what I see going forward is probably more growth in YA specifically. I think we'll see more interactive fiction. I'm seeing a lot of things like text-based games with queer characters. There's several out on Choice of Games that are pretty interesting, for example. I think that there'll be, they'll continue to be, as long as there is an accessible and free internet, there'll continue to be a lot of publication that revolves around ebooks and online stuff. What I would like to see is more mainstream publishers stepping up and putting the marketing behind some of the books by queer authors who are currently doing very well with the novella length works, with short stories. I'd like to see them put the marketing behind those works so that they can succeed, so that we get to see more longer works, we get to see more diverse voices. We're seeing a lot more people of color, we're getting a lot more international voices. There's so many things that have really gotten a lot better in the field in terms of the quality of work that we can read. It would be lovely to see that continue and grow.
I just have to jump in to say I wholeheartedly agree. I feel like the main publishing industry, like the mainstream publishing, tends to, like, they publish one book about a queer character and they say, okay, fire the confetti cannons, it's Pride Month. Now we're going to publish 300 more books about heterosexual love triangles.
Right. So it's all about money. I'm going to put my MBA hat on for a moment and talk about that, because Catherine's exactly right that, YA is sort of a hub for the money these days. And a lot of authors have been migrating over the last decade or so toward the YA trough. I remember lots of writer friends who were trying to do that and who very successfully did that. But there's money there. When there's money there, you get attention by the big houses. So back in the day, maybe about 20 years ago, the corporations decided that, oh, hey, gay money was real, and there's a lot of it, and we ought to start, like, courting it. I think the same thing is going to happen when they realize just how much money that we are spending buying our works. Then you're going to see the big houses start to pay attention and start to put money toward publishing, start to put money toward promotional tours, things like that, things that we don't have right now. So that's just my take on that.
The only thing I was thinking to add as an author, I don't know if this is a fair dualism or not, but I tend to look at it in terms of you've got two tracks going on. You've got the literary track, and then you've got the mainstream stuff. And there are promising signs, as Catherine and Michael have pointed out, such that you've got Lambda winners getting mentioned in Publishers Weekly kind of thing, and that's definitely massive progress, and it seems like it's here to stay. But the debate seems to now be, so what happens to mainstream fiction? Like, what happens at that end of the market?
Well, it's been shrinking. I mean, that pond has been getting smaller and smaller, and the blockbusters have been, taking more and more of the pie. So, that's why people have been pushed down into, indie publishers, small presses, people that you wouldn't normally see there like 20 years ago. And it's a good thing. There's a lot more diversity out there because of the indie publishing and even the self-publishing. It's hard to wade through a lot of it.
Bob, we said we'd try and get you to repeat the bit that you were saying in answer to what does queer speculative fiction mean to you. You were there was several comments saying, I really wanted to hear what Bob said. So can you dive in and do that now?
And I think that when we lost you, you were about to talk about the Towering Inferno.
Yeah.
Oh, I mentioned that my friend Frank Robinson, who was a Harvey Milk speechwriter also, he wrote many, many, many novels, and he always had a queer character in there. And so there was a lot of subversion in that. It's sort of one of those things where, people may gloss over it, but it sticks in their heads, and eventually the concept that if you have a queer character in there, oh, he's got to be a villain, sort of started going away. So his first novel was 1956. That was The Power. His second novel, written with Frank Scotia, was turned into The Towering Inferno. And there was a really, if you read the book, it didn't make the movie, but the book has a lovely gay couple that was in there. And then there was like a surviving gay man who ran a little shop, but in the tower. And he was instrumental in helping a young mother and her queer son survive and have him go through a lot of machinations about, oh, I'm queer, what do I do? And at the end of the book, he and the queer not main character, but the queer character helped the younger boy, sort of took him under his wing as a kind of surrogate or whatever, and helped him that way. And it was a really lovely little story that got buried in there, but it's worthwhile looking up. So a lot of authors used to do things like that. I think we all did that. I mean, that was saving for us. I mean, all the stories that I wrote way back then had just like a little tinge of queer stuff in there, but it was all positive, and it was always okay to be gay or anything else in the stories that I wrote back then. I hope that was it. Let me see, where's the...
All right, are we ready to move on to the next question, or does somebody want to address anything further about what we think the future holds? Because I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on that, Bob, or anybody else.
I just wanted to note something that came up during a coffee time informal chat with Scott and a few others yesterday, which is just the point that it's easy to forget how old we're getting. And that some...
No, it's not. Maybe for you.
Speak for yourself, Ken.
Sorry,
Right.
just expressing that
Well,
briefly.
no, it's easy for me too, because some Generation Z or Zoomers are 25 years old now, and
Yep.
representation and writing queer work, the issues are all very different for them than they are for Boomers and Generation X, to the point where, like, very loosely, perhaps you could say, for them, it's just much less of an issue now. It's more kind of like, you do you, get on with your stuff. I don't see the problem. So you've got all these different things going on in culture all at the same time, depending on the generation. So as a creator, the question is, how do you try to please everybody across the generation? We're all in different places with this stuff.
I don't have a reason to try and please everybody. I mean, I'm trying to write the stories that I need to be told. So to try and like please everybody, I'm not going to please anybody. I'm not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately you write for yourself, and then you hope it finds an audience. And I think that there's a lot of things that speak across generations that maybe we don't expect to. For example, I have this novel about menopausal werewolves. So my primary audience is mostly middle-aged women, many of them queer, but quite a few straight, quite a few cis. But I have also had multiple trans people come to me over the course of the last couple of years and tell me, people much younger than me, and tell me that that was their coming out novel. So you never know what people are going to find and what they're going to get out of your work. And I think that's something that it's beyond your control. And sometimes it's going to be amazing. There's going to be stuff like that. And sometimes it's going to be, you're sitting there looking at a review and going, I did not say that. So there's always going to be kind of a range on that. What you want is to get stuff out there and, do your best to help it find its people. And, it goes from there.
Stick to writing what you know.
I think that I think it's very true. My experience of talking to younger people on the rare occasions that I do that has definitely been that they tend to have a sort of performative comfort about their own identities and stuff, and regardless of how easy it has been for them to discover who they are and express who they are, even if they are 100% comfortable with themselves, at 18, I think that they still live in a world where there are people who are not comfortable with who they are. And so they still have to go through some degree of the experience of facing prejudice, of facing discrimination, of learning that a world that they expected would just embrace them because they have so easily embraced themselves has problems with who they are and what they've embraced about themselves. So even if the experience on average of a given generation is a thing, whether it's a very high degree of prejudice and discrimination or a very low degree in their own ability to accept themselves, they're still living in a multi-generational world, and they're still experiencing some of the effects of all of those generations' experiences. I think that the most comfortable teenager in the world may still have somebody in their life who would judge them for who they are. And the shyest elderly person who is just, starting to peek out of the closet is still going to be shocked when they find out that there are people who don't care about their identity and their gender expression. And I think that, that's all still a shared experience.
It's like Bill Gibson's thing. He said, the future is here, it's just not widely distributed. So it's the same thing with acceptance and tolerance. I mean, there are these bubbles of fundamentalist, culture that kids are being raised up in. They have no idea what else is going on. So yeah.
People who grow up in my hometown now, today, they learn very quickly that the internet tells them that they are great, and the people around them tell them that they are not okay. And so they still very much have that experience, and they still have to go through a coming out process. And there are plenty of places that people still want to escape.
Yes, there are.
Would this actually be a good time to pause and do our charity plugs?
I thought we were going to just put those in the chat. So maybe we should do those at the end.
Yeah.
just because it's going to break up the
Yeah, and
discussion a little bit to do it now, I think.
we've got 15 minutes left.
Okay.
So you want to move on?
Yeah, because I think we haven't really talked much. I mean, we talked a little bit about our individual queer past. Maybe we can kind of touch on that a little more.
There's the title question itself. Does the past influence the future?
Well,
Is that where we are?
yeah, that would have been the next one. And Angel's just reminded us we also have some questions as well, but some of them are related, I think, to talking a little more about this topic. So one of the things that, I mentioned when we were going through and planning this panel is that what you see in a lot of, and it's more visible now in probably TV and movies, but what used to show up a lot more in queer spec fic and the written forms is the influence of the AIDS crisis. And you've got a lot of people who are show producers, who are publishers, who are senior editors, particularly at large houses, who came of age, much as several of us did, during the AIDS crisis. And within the US, that really shaped a lot of cultural perceptions. So there's a phrase that we all kick around amongst ourselves, kill your gays. And there's a couple of variations on it, red shirt and so forth. But one of the things that I think that comes out of is people going, straight people experiencing the AIDS crisis, looking at it and making decisions on some of the media that they saw when they were first getting into the field. So you've got a lot of stuff where you bump off your gay character because it builds sympathy, where your queer character has some sort of, wasting disease or gets horribly bashed and dies because you're dealing with people whose main perception of queer people has been shaped by, watching Torch Song Trilogy or looking at portions of the AIDS quilt. And what comes away is that we as a community build more sympathy when we're dead or dying than we do when we're alive. And I think that's one of the things that's been the hardest about breaking into more mainstream platforms, which more people see and more people connect with, that I've seen over the past 20 years, is getting past the, no, we didn't all die. No, we're not always dying. Yes, we can be three-dimensional characters without dying. How cool is that? And there's a lot of energy that I think goes into that I think is less visible to younger generations because they're interacting online and they're building different kinds of communities, and it doesn't, wash over the same way, but then you turn on the television and we're going through the whole cycle again. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
I think that you point out something so important about the queer story, which is that people outside of the queer communities they experience queerness almost exclusively as a crisis. And I think that one of the ways that we're seeing that reflected in stories now that is also problematic is that trans stories are almost always depict only the transition, and they don't talk about the trans person's life after that point. They don't stories about trans people by people who are not trans almost always focus on that transition rather than on the person. I think that one of the ways that the culture that we live in now will depict us 20 years from now is that it will get stuck in the sort of shallow celebratory, queer eye for the straight guy kind of mode, where we will sort of be stuck simultaneously sort of fetishized and reviled. We currently are living through an era where state legislatures pass bathroom bills and they try to repeal gay marriage and they try to ban gay adoption and things like that. And people outside of queerness will still see a lot of things about queerness as a crisis and depict that. But they will also see queerness as being sort of this fun party, perpetual party state. And they will try to depict that, and neither of those is realistic.
Well, they also see what is it, Ted Cook, the president of Apple, or the CEO of Apple, and you know, David Geffen and you know, a couple other very, very wealthy gays doing very well in the business world. So, but the media, you're right. I mean, the media, like Queer Eye for This Great Guy, is kind of makes things look like a party a lot. People know normal queers because of social media, and I think that's I want to applaud social media and the history of it, because it showed everyone over the years, over the last decade or so, that they knew at least one of us, you know, and visibility was key. And I think that that helped you know, propel us forward in making, in general, the country very comfortable with having gay couples around. I mean, Ben and I have been together for 32 years. I mean, when we're together, there's no way that anybody would say, "Oh, those are just friends." You know, it's obvious that we are together. And you know, even way before we were able to get married. So yeah, so I think social media is changing things and smoothing.
Have we lost Bob again?
And we lost
Yeah, I
Bob
think
again.
so.
So go ahead, Trevor.
Okay, excellent points, well made. I don't have a huge amount to add, but just in thinking about this to prepare for today, the only thing I think that might be useful to pause and reflect on, and it's in some ways a hard point to make, because across the community, the LGBT community, you know, there is real pain, and I don't by any means wish to detract from that, but as creatives, there's a challenge on us to consider what we're doing, because in any genre or any sort of from any background as a writer, we often draw on pain for inspiration, for ideas. So, but put that in this context, there's a challenge on our hands, or like a balance to find, perhaps, between drawing on pain to tell the stories that need to be told, and inhabiting the ground that we have actually gained, without sort of recreating it in a way that means that we're taking backward steps.
I mean, I agree. I think that it would be sort of fundamentally dishonest to present a queer story that does not acknowledge the trials and tribulations that queer identities come with in the culture that we live in. But I also think it is important, because nobody else is going to do it for us, to tell stories that celebrate the joy of queerness as well, even if it's simply the joy of finally being comfortable in one's own skin.
Yes, let's celebrate the joy.
Are you
So,
back, Bob?
hello?
Yes.
You know, our perspective is gained by living a long time. It's through difficult times it produces wonderful works. There's something to be said for experience in life, you know, and craft. Knowing history, one's own history, is always going to have a unique effect on whatever it is that particular writer or you make. Our queer past is perspective. So does history matter? I say yes. And I also say no, because the thing that has the greatest effect on what is happening to anyone is our experience now. That's what's molding the future.
Okay.
What's going on out there at Bob's house, but it's not going well, whatever it is.
Oh, you're back now, Bob.
Oh, well.
Should we move on to the questions? Because there's quite a few
Yeah.
of them.
Got a
Yeah.
bunch of questions.
I think
There's
we
one
have.
from, go ahead.
I think we had an answer, because Catherine touched on Jeff Ryman, so I think we kind of.
Yep. Yeah, he features in the column that I mentioned, which is out in the chat. So.
Scott has a question based on something you said, Catherine. Catherine said something fascinating. The magic of queer history is that we just keep rewriting it. Are we in danger of repeating past mistakes in the future? And if so, crystal ball time here, which ones?
Well, I do think there's something to that, because, I mean, obviously, because I said it. But what tends to happen with a lot of queer history, I mean, a lot of our early stuff We lose because people were underground, people were closeted, there was no way to preserve it. For example, my work and Queen of Swords' work is archived at the Trevor collection at the University of Minnesota, which is one of the largest LGBTQ archives in the world. And it was basically started by, a gay man who just collected boxes and boxes of stuff. And, as friends died, as friends passed on, whatever happened, he was just collecting their possessions. So he built the entire collection based on stuff he had in boxes and closets in his apartment. So we have a lot of stuff like that where we don't have that kind of, we don't have a stable archival history in a lot of ways. We've also got, the traditional problem where history is written by the winners. And so there are missing perspectives, there are missing chunks of things where, we're just now learning about, vibrant queer Black communities in some cities that, a lot of us would have not necessarily known about at all if it had not been for things getting out on the internet. The problem is, of course, that once things go out on the internet is that sites disappear, people move on, things don't get maintained, they get dropped. So it's a question of how you build an idea of queer history such that, it's accessible and people can get, a big picture of what was going on in different communities at the time. And I think it's better than it was, but it's definitely still very challenging. So I'll do a brief plug for supporting, if you have a queer library or an archive near you, please support them because they're doing some really important work. Here in Minneapolis, we have Quatrefoil Library, which despite being on Lake Street was not burned or vandalized or targeted during the riots recently. So that's been really great. We also have the Trevor collection at the University of Minnesota. These are some great resources.
There's also the Fort Lauderdale Stonewall Museum and History and Library, which is down there. You can get a membership, and if you go down there, you can borrow books, but they also have lists of books.
Question, another one from the Q&A. Bob, this is from Susanna. Bob, I'm completely fascinated by the perspective you're offering. When you mention queer villains, I'm curious, do you mean visibly gay or queer villains or coded villainy? Like, I don't know, the fruity villainy of Scar in The Lion King. And I'm pointing that question out because that's one of my favorite questions on any panel.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll definitely, I'll take it first and we'll circle back. So back in the day, like in the 1900s, in the last century, in the 1900s, there were a lot of, like the noir thrillers, for instance, often had like the gay villain. It was, the murderer or somebody who would get killed. There were even very popular gay books, like romance books, like written by, I'm thinking Gordon Merrick, who always had a gay character in them. And at the end, he killed him off, even though it was even though it was like kind of a positive thing. The character had to die. And he did that because they said they wouldn't publish him otherwise. So, there was a lot of that going on. And Catherine and Michael, and perhaps Trevor can speak also. Michael?
I love coded queer villains in stories, partly because characters are villains because they have decided that what they want is more important than the rules that society has presented them with for how to achieve it. And that's a very queer concept. And I love it. And I love queer coded villains who are flamboyant and mean and vicious and cruel because they have decided that what they want matters and what people are willing to allow them to have does not matter as much. And there is a way in which that is a very powerful form of queerness that I think, I mean, I'm not saying that I want to, do whatever science fiction queer villainy thing is being presented. I'm not saying that I want to fill the planet with nougat, but if filling the planet with nougat is what gets me what I want, then I'm okay with it, maybe. And I feel like that's a pretty great queer perspective. I love that. I mean, look at Ursula from The Little Mermaid, literally based on a drag queen. And I think that that's a really great queer character.
If there's time, I'd just like to say a bit about one of Susanna's other questions. She says, what do you think of the notion that the concept of queer or gay fiction as opposed to mainstream fiction may wind up seeing category collapse over the next 20 years or so as the teenagers of today, many of whom take much more flexible view of gender and attraction than their parents did, come of age and become the drivers of the reading and media consuming market? I think that's a pattern and trend I definitely see. I can see it being a very good thing, and mainstream publishers ignore that at their peril. But I say it with both glee and trepidation, because writers need to write, and we need full service publishers. Otherwise, there is no career as authors. So we need traditional publishing and curation to stick around. Otherwise, it's not a viable job for us. So publishers had better look out at what's happening in that sector.
There's the concept from before, like a lot of when gay marriage equality came around, people were complaining, especially in the gay community, that they've lost their edge. You know, they've lost the edginess and that special driver that helped them make, you know, edge fiction. And there was a famous New Yorker cartoon that came out. This gay couple is looking down there at the gay pride parade in New York City, and the caption is, "We're here, we're queer, we're used to it." You know, so complacency is something that I think that this question is sort of getting at. I think that it's just going to bubble up in different ways, and I'd like to see more mainstreaming, and doesn't mean publisher, but more mainstreaming as in that there's always a gay character in there because we're always everywhere, you know, that kind of thing. So it becomes normalized to some degree. So that would anger a few other people. But
okay, so we're down to 2 minutes. So I'm going to put the story bundle plug out in the chat.
Okay.
This is for a current Pride Month story bundle. It includes Bob's book, Best Game Ever. I'm curating one of the books I publish is in it. It's great, and it's benefiting Rainbow Railroad, which works with LGBTQ refugees. Trevor.
I've just recently met on my travels a fantastic young guy from Kenya who's running a project called Youth Against Suicides, helping LGBT youth in Kenya at school or college age away from the brink of suicide and into better mental health. I've helped him set up a Patreon for his project. I'm just about to post it here in the comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob or Michael, any work you want to plug?
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm also a supporter for efforts against suicide, people that help hotlines and so forth. So I definitely would plug the Trevor Project. So if that's, yeah.
And I'm going to put a link in the Q&A in a second. That is for a Pride bundle that my publisher has put together, where they are celebrating all of the LGBTQIA+ authors that they publish. I have 2 novels in that. It's $4.99 for 10 books, and it's an amazing deal with some really great writers in it across a whole lot of different identities and a lot of different kinds of stories. It has my Perishables, which is a vampire urban fantasy series about a vampire lord who lives in suburbia, and it has Through the Doors of Oblivion, which is urban fantasy with non-binary and queer characters in San Francisco.
So,
this could have been 2 sessions, I feel.
Yeah. So I want to just read a thing that I wrote. It's, "Now is the time for the young, romping forward, thinking that it has always been this way, and fearlessly moving ahead, not knowing what they cannot do. When they are older, they will look back and chronicle how they got there, but let them run now, let them lead. When they are done, there will be new young people pushing forward to replace them." So I'm very optimistic about all of this.
I love that.
That's my parting shot. Anybody, any other parting shots did we say? Are we done? Or?
I think that if I have a parting shot, it's that in the future, like the people who are very young and have those very fluid identities are potentially going to write a lot of stories that are sort of nostalgic about earlier times when people were more marginalized. And it's going to be really interesting to see their take on our history.
Yes.
Sure.
So finding, how do you get new stuff? Go to cons like RSM.
Yeah.
Yep.
Read queer sci-fi.
And go to local and
Read queer
regional
sci-fi. Yes, go out, go forth and
Yeah.
read sci-fi.
And go to local and regional science fiction conventions and ask for content about queer stories.
Very good point. Very, very good point. And also, you know, if you happen to be in a bookstore, notice that they don't have a gay and lesbian section anymore, or a GLBTQ section. Ask where all the gay and lesbian trans books are, you know, GLBTQ books are. A lot of times they say, well, they're just in our catalog. Say, well, that doesn't help me. We want the shelves back.
Y'all, this has been a lot of fun.
This has been great, you guys. Thank you all.
If there's a con, the same con next year, and we do this topic, let's spread it out. Like cover this properly. This could have gone on for twice as long, I think. Great fun, guys.